Horror is one of, if not my favorite genre in all of media. Whether it's books, movies, TV shows, or in this case video games, it's always been the genre that sticks with me the longest. There's something uniquely fascinating about the way horror can make us feel emotions that we actively avoid in real life. Fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. These are all things that we'd normally run from, yet in fiction we willingly seek them out. When most people think of horror games, they probably picture franchises like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, or Outlast. Games that are designed from the ground up to scare you. They use monsters, darkness, limited resources, and jump scares to keep you on edge. And they do it incredibly well. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that some of the most memorable moments of horror I've experienced didn't come from horror games at all. Sometimes it's staring into the endless ocean in Subnautica. Sometimes it's mining alone in Minecraft, hearing a cave sound echo through the darkness, or drifting through the silent emptiness of space in Outer Wilds. None of these moments rely on cheap jump scares. Instead, they tap into something much deeper. That's because horror really isn't a genre. It's a feeling. Whether it's the fear of the unknown, psychological manipulation, existential dread, body horror, or complete isolation, games across every genre have found ways to make players genuinely uncomfortable. Some do it intentionally, while others almost stumble into it by accident. And in many cases, those moments linger with us far longer than the scares we expected. So today, I want to look at the different ways games create horror, whether they're marketed as horror games or not, and why some of the scariest experiences in gaming come from the places you'd least expect it. Subnautica is terrifying because it understands that the imagination is almost always scarier than the monster itself. Unlike traditional horror games that want you to constantly see or confront the threat, Subnautica hides it beneath murky water, behind massive drop-offs, or somewhere just outside of your field of view. Every dive into a deeper biome feels like a gamble because you never truly know what's waiting below. The game rarely rushes you with danger. Instead, it lets your own curiosity fight against your instincts for self-preservation. The unknown isn't just part of the world, it's the core gameplay loop. What makes this so effective is that Subnautica weaponizes one of the most common human fears, the fear of deep water, or thalassophobia. As you progress, the ocean floor slowly disappears beneath you. Sunlight fades away, and familiar colorful reefs give way to vast stretches of darkness. You're forced to descend into places where you can no longer see what's beneath you, beside you, or behind you. At this point, your imagination begins filling in the blanks, and it's almost always worse than the reality. The game's sound design amplifies this perfectly. Long before you ever encounter a leviathan, you'll hear an echoing roar somewhere in the distance. It's impossible to tell how far away it is, what direction it came from, or whether it's moving towards you. That uncertainty creates a level of tension that few horror games can replicate. You're not reacting to a monster, you're reacting to the possibility of one. The game also states in the lore that if you can hear a Reaper Leviathan, that means it can see you. So, just think about that next time you play the game. Subnautica also understands the value of restraint. It doesn't constantly throw enemies at the player or rely on scripted scares to keep the tension high. Instead, it allows long periods of calm exploration, making every unsettling sound, every shadow in the water, and every glimpse of movement feel significant. Because the game spends so much time convincing you that the ocean is beautiful and worth exploring, it becomes that much more effective when it reminds you that you are not the apex predator. You're simply another creature trying to survive in an ecosystem that could care less whether you make it out alive. Still Wakes the Deep thrives on uncertainty. From the moment things begin to go wrong, the game deliberately withholds information about the creature, its origins, and even its intentions. You spend much of the experience navigating an oil rig that is slowly falling apart while trying to piece together what exactly you're dealing with. Because the threat is never fully understood, every new encounter feels unpredictable. Fear comes from realizing that you can't prepare for something you don't comprehend. Unlike many horror games that eventually pull back the curtain and explain the monsters, Still Wakes the Deep resists giving the player complete answers. You catch glimpses of impossible shapes, hear unsettling noises echo through the rig, and witness horrific transformations without ever fully understanding what it is that you're looking at. Your mind naturally begins to try and fill in those gaps, and that uncertainty becomes far more frightening than any clear explanation could be. The game understands that once a monster is completely understood, it becomes something that can be anticipated. And by refusing to provide certainty, it keeps players in a constant state of unease. The setting itself also plays a huge role in creating this fear. An offshore oil rig is already an inherently vulnerable place. It's isolated, surrounded by endless ocean, and packed with narrow corridors, industrial machinery, and dangerous environments. As the infection spreads, those once familiar spaces begin to twist into something almost unrecognizable. Hallways become blocked, structures collapse, and areas you've already explored suddenly feel alien to you. The game takes a location that should represent routine and stability and slowly transforms it into a place where you can no longer trust your surroundings. Even the gameplay reinforces this uncertainty. You're almost never, ever in complete control. Actually, you're never in control, really. Instead of standing your ground and fighting, you're often forced to run, hide, or climb and improvise. Every escape feels messy and desperate because you're reacting to a threat you don't fully understand, rather than executing a carefully planned strategy. The game constantly reminds you that survival isn't about mastering the enemy, it's about enduring something that exists far beyond your understanding. Pacific Drive transforms something as ordinary as driving into an exercise in paranoia. Set within the mysterious Olympic exclusion zone, the game fills its world with strange anomalies that refuse to obey normal human logic. Rocks suddenly shift on their own, abandoned objects float through the air, storms behave in impossible ways, and reality itself seems to bend and distort around you. Since the game never fully explains every anomaly or why the zone behaves the way it does, each journey feels like venturing into hostile territory, where the rules are constantly changing. The fear isn't simply that something will attack you, it's that the world itself refuses to make sense. What makes this so effective is that Pacific Drive forces players to question the environment at every turn. In most games, players quickly learn what objects are dangerous and which ones can be safely ignored. Pacific Drive deliberately takes away that comfort. A harmless-looking object could suddenly become a deadly anomaly, while an area that seems safe on your last trip may be completely different next time you return. The game constantly teaches you that your previous knowledge is never enough, creating an underlying tension that persists even during quiet moments. The zone itself almost feels alive. It doesn't behave like traditional games would with fixed rules and predictable hazards. Instead, it reacts in ways that are often impossible to anticipate, making every expedition feel like an experiment rather than a routine mission. Even after dozens of successful runs, there's always the feeling that the next trip could introduce something you've never encountered before. That unpredictability keeps players alert, never allowing them to become truly comfortable. Your car also plays an important role in the feeling of uncertainty. Throughout the game, it's your only real source of safety, your shelter, your lifeline. But it's never invincible. Every strange encounter leaves behind damage that needs to be repaired, forcing you to constantly maintain and upgrade the one thing standing between you and the zone. As a result, the vehicle becomes more than just transportation. It becomes your home in a world where everything else feels hostile and unknowable. Every new crack, flicker of the dashboard, and new scratch reminds you just how fragile that safety really is. Unlike many horror games that rely on monsters lurking in the shadows, Pacific Drive finds horror in unpredictability itself. It creates fear by stripping away certainty and replacing it with a world that can never be fully understood. Every trip into the zone feels like stepping into a place where logic no longer applies, and that's exactly what makes it such a compelling example of fear of the unknown. This game was marketed as a horror game, quite the horror game. Actually, in my opinion, the epitome of horror games. But just because it was marketed like that and just because it was perceived as that and I guess is that, doesn't mean that it does what some of these low-ball horror games do. It still invokes so much fear into you, and I was very fortunate to be able to play it before it was taken off of the PlayStation Store all that time ago. And I think you know what I'm talking about because I said that. But this game is the epitome of psychological horror. Like I said, this game is the definition of horror. And honestly, it consists of every aspect I've talked about and will talk about further into the video. PT demonstrates that horror doesn't require constant action, actually very little action. By forcing players to walk through the same hallway over and over, the game creates an intimate familiarity with the environment before slowly corrupting it. Tiny changes become monumental because players begin obsessively searching for differences. Eventually, you stop fearing what's in the hallway and start fearing the hallway itself. PT weaponizes anticipation, teaching players to dread what might happen rather than what actually does. What makes this so effective is how quickly the game trains the player's brain. After only a few loops, you begin memorizing every detail. The pictures on the walls, the lighting, the sound on the radio, the position of the doors and furniture. Once that familiarity is established, even the smallest alteration feels deeply wrong. A light flickers differently, a sound appears where it shouldn't, or an object seems slightly out of place, and suddenly the entire space feels unsafe. The game turns ordinary observation into a source of anxiety. PT also understands the anticipation is often more powerful than the scare itself. Long stretches of seemingly uneventful walking force players to expect something terrible at any moment. The hallway becomes a machine for generating tension because every corner, every doorway, and every new loop carries the possibility of change. You aren't reacting to danger that's already present. You're bracing for danger that could appear at any second. That constant state of expectation is exhausting in the best possible way. The sound design also amplifies the psychological pressure. Distant noises, muffled cries, radio broadcast, and sudden silences create the feeling that something is always nearby, even when nothing is visible. And let me tell you something, it's probably very well known at this point, but this lady, this one right here, the beautiful woman that we see on our adventures in the hallways, yeah, she's always behind you. She's just always constantly behind you, moving directly with you. So if you turn in either direction, she just follows right behind. I wish this fucking game was made, man. It was so good. Because the game rarely gives players complete information, their imagination starts filling in the gaps, often creating fears more intense than anything shows on screen. And honestly, I don't think I have ever been as disappointed to hear of a game cancellation than this one right here. And it is such a shame. Mouthwashing is another great example of psychological horror. Mouthwashing proves that psychological horror doesn't need monsters lurking around every corner. Instead, it traps players inside increasingly fractured relationships, uncomfortable conversations, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. The horror grows from emotional tension rather than physical danger. As reality becomes less reliable and the crew deteriorates mentally, players are left questioning not just what's happening, but how much of it can be trusted. The result is an experience where discomfort steadily replaces fear until the two become inseparable. Rather than relying on constant threats or chase sequences, mouthwashing creates horror through the people around you. Every interaction feels loaded with tension, every conversation seems to carry something left unsaid, and every member of the crew is dealing with their own emotional unraveling. The game understands that people can be just as unsettling as monsters when trust begins to break down. As relationships deteriorate, even quiet moments become uncomfortable because you're never quite sure how another character will react or what they're truly thinking. The game's fragmented storytelling reinforces this feeling of uncertainty. Information is deliberately withheld, events are presented out of order, and the line between memory, reality, and perception become increasingly blurred. Instead of giving players a clear understanding of what happened, mouthwashing forces them to slowly assemble the truth for themselves. Every new revelation reframes what came before, encouraging players to constantly question whether their previous assumptions were ever correct in the first place. What makes the psychological horror especially effective is its focus on guilt and consequence. Rather than presenting horror as something external that can simply be escaped, the game suggests that some of the most terrifying things come from within. Regret, denial, responsibility, and the inability to escape the consequences of past actions become far more oppressive than any physical threat. The horror follows the characters because it exists inside them, making it impossible to outrun. The game's atmosphere supports this perfectly. The claustrophobic spaceship, repetitive routines, and gradual deterioration of both the environment and its inhabitants create a constant sense of pressure. There's very little relief from the tension because the game rarely allows players to feel emotionally safe. Even during moments of silence, there's an underlying feeling that something is deeply wrong, making every interaction feel like it could unravel at any moment. A game not necessarily marketed as a horror game, however, one of the most unsettling games, and a game that definitely makes me feel a bit uncomfortable when playing it, is The Stanley Parable. The Stanley Parable turns free will into something deeply unsettling. Rather than threatening the player physically, it constantly questions whether your decisions actually matter. Every attempt to resist the narrator only reinforces his influence, creating this strange feeling that you're participating in a game designed to manipulate your behavior. It's unsettling because the game transforms something we usually take for granted, player agency, into the central source of anxiety. From the very beginning, the game presents players with what appears to be complete freedom. You can follow the narrator's instructions or deliberately ignore them, choosing your own path through the empty office building. At first, this feels empowering, as though you're shaping your own story, but the longer you play, the more you realize that every act of rebellion has been anticipated. Whether you obey or resist, the game always seems to be one step ahead, making your choices feel less like the expression of free will and more like another branch in a script that was written long before you arrived. The narrator plays a huge role in creating the psychological discomfort. Rather than acting as an enemy, he becomes a constant presence that comments on, questions, and occasionally mocks your decisions. Sometimes he sounds disappointed, other times amused, and occasionally even frustrated, but he always seems aware of what you're about to do. This creates an unusual relationship where the player isn't fighting a monster or escaping danger, they're struggling against the feeling of being observed and understood by something that knows them better than they actually know themselves. The game's empty environment reinforces this idea. The office is almost completely devoid of life, leaving players alone with little more than their own thoughts and the narrator's voice. Silence between conversations becomes just as important as the dialogue itself, giving players time to question whether they're actually making meaningful decisions or simply following another carefully designed path. The lack of other characters or distractions forces you to focus entirely on the relationship between yourself, the narrator, and the game. What makes the Stanley Parable such an effective piece of psychological horror is that it attacks one of the fundamental assumptions of video games, that the player is in control. Instead of taking away your ability to make choices, it does something far more unsettling. It allows you to make them, then quietly reminds you that every decision you thought was your own may have been accounted for all along. This results in a game that leaves players questioning not only the nature of choice within its world, but the illusion of choice in a game as a whole. I also want to say, I don't know about you guys, but if you've ever played this game and you've just been walking around the office building, it's weird, man. It makes you feel weird. It's almost Backrooms-esque because no one's there, and it's just kind of you, and especially when you're kind of just putzing around and the narrator's not talking, and obviously you have no dialogue, and you're just kind of moving through this office building expecting to see somebody in these spaces that look like they're occupied, but nobody's there. It gives you such a sense of unease and messes with you psychologically, and it is one of the only games where I've just felt so odd when walking around and not trying to complete the storyline or get to the next task. It just makes me feel very uncomfortable, and not a lot of games have done that. Now, this isn't necessarily a game, but a quest from a game. Frostflow Lighthouse quest in Skyrim is frightening because it reminds players that not every tragedy can be prevented by the Dragonborn. Unlike most quests in the game where the Dragonborn arrives just in time to defeat the villain or save the day, Frostflow Lighthouse begins after the story has already ended. The family that once lived there is gone and dead, and all that's left behind are abandoned rooms, scattered belongings, and journals that slowly reveal what had happened. Rather than placing the player at the center of a heroic adventure, the quest turns them into an observer, forcing them to piece together the aftermath of an irreversible tragedy. What makes this so unsettling is the way Bethesda tells the story almost entirely through the environment. There are no dramatic cutscenes or emotional speeches explaining the events. Instead, every bloodstain, overturned piece of furniture, and abandoned personal item quietly contributes to the narrative. As you descend further beneath the lighthouse, the environment itself becomes increasingly oppressive, transforming from a place of warmth and safety into a reminder of how quickly that security can disappear. The game trusts that the player is able to connect these pieces together, making the horror feel more personal because you're actually uncovering it rather than simply being told about it. The quest also creates a powerful sense of inevitability, as each journal fills in another piece of the family's final days. You already know that there's no happy ending waiting at the bottom. You're not searching for survivors or racing against time. You're simply discovering how everything fell apart. That knowledge creates a lingering sense of dread because every new clue only confirms what you've already begun to suspect. The player is powerless to change the outcome, leaving them with nothing but the weight of witnessing it. More than anything, Frostflow Lighthouse reminds players how indifferent Skyrim's world can be. While you're off slaying dragons, becoming guild masters, or saving entire cities, ordinary people are still living their own lives and dying. The family story isn't connected to some world-ending prophecy of a legendary hero. It's simply one of the countless tragedies that occur without recognition, making the world feel far larger and more uncaring than the player might otherwise realize. That realization is what gives the quest its existential weight. It forces players to confront the idea that even in a world built around them, suffering exists independently of their actions, and some stories end long before anyone arrives to tell them. This is another example of a game, or I guess the quest in the game, where when you enter the Frostflow Lighthouse, it just makes you feel awed. And I think that's a big sort of reason why I wanted to make this video, is certain games that just make you feel off when they are not necessarily supposed to. Soma shifts horror away from survival and towards identity itself. Rather than asking whether you'll escape, it asks what it actually means to be a person. Throughout the game, players are repeatedly forced to question consciousness, memory, and whether continuity of thoughts is enough to define who we are. The monster becomes secondary to the philosophical questions that they leave behind. Long after the credits roll, it's these ideas, not the enemies, that continue haunting the player. What makes Soma so unique is that it constantly challenges assumptions most of us never stop to question. If your memories could be perfectly copied into another body or machine, would it still be you? If another version of yourself continued living while you and your own consciousness remained behind, which one is the real person? These aren't simply questions the game asks through dialogue. They become situations the player is forced to experience firsthand. Instead of telling you about existential philosophy, Soma places you directly inside of it. The underwater setting reinforces these themes in subtle but powerful ways. Pathos 2 is isolated at the bottom of the ocean, completely cut off from the rest of humanity. The crushing darkness outside every window serves as a constant reminder that there is nowhere else to go. The world above is gone. Communication is almost non-existent, and the few remaining inhabitants are often trapped somewhere between life and death. The environment creates a profound feeling of loneliness that mirrors the game's larger questions about existence and identity. The monsters themselves also reflect these ideas rather than simply existing as obstacles. They're disturbing not only because of their appearance, but because they represent people whose humanity has been twisted. Every encounter serves as another reminder that the line separating human and machine has become hopelessly blurred. Instead of asking players to fear death, Soma asks them to consider whether a fate worse than death might be continuing to exist without truly being alive. Perhaps the game's greatest strength is that it refuses to provide easy answers. Every major revelation raises new questions instead of resolving old ones, forcing players to grapple with the ideas that have no universally satisfying solutions. Even after the story ends, it's difficult to stop thinking about the choices that were made and what they ultimately mean. Few horror games leave players reflecting on their own existence long after they put the controller down, but Soma does exactly that. Outer Wilds presents a universe that is beautiful, mysterious, and utterly indifferent to your existence. Every loop reinforces the fact that some events cannot be prevented, no matter how much knowledge you gain. Rather than treating the end of the universe as something to overcome, the game invites the players to accept it. The fear comes from recognizing that not every mystery has a solution, and not every ending can be avoided. It's a rare form of horror built entirely on acceptance instead of survival. Unlike most games, Outer Wilds doesn't ask players to become stronger or more powerful in order to save the day. In fact, the only thing that truly changes throughout the game is your understanding of the universe. You don't gain better weapons or stronger armor like normal games. Instead, every discovery slowly teaches you that the universe follows rules far greater than yourself, and no amount of determination can change that. The game quietly dismantles one of the most common expectations in video games, that if you try hard enough, there's always a way to win. The game setting reinforces this feeling constantly. Space is breathtakingly beautiful, but it's also overwhelmingly empty. As you drift between planets, you're reminded just how small you really are. A single mistake can leave you floating endlessly through the vacuum, watching your oxygen slowly disappear with nothing around you but silence. Black holes, collapsing planets, and dying stars aren't presented as villains to defeat. They're simply natural parts of the universe that operates completely independently of your existence. The universe isn't trying to kill you. It simply doesn't care whether you live or die. Even exploring itself contributes to the game's existential themes. Every mystery you uncover answers one question. Every mystery you uncover answers one question while revealing several more, creating the feeling that true understanding will always remain just out of reach. Rather than presenting knowledge as a means of controlling the world, Outer Wilds treats it as a way of appreciating it. The more you learn, the more you realize how ancient, complex, and ultimately temporary everything is, including yourself. What makes Outer Wilds so emotionally powerful is that it never frames its realization as hopeless. Instead, it argues the impermanence is precisely what gives life its meaning. Every loop, every discovery, and every relationship matters not because it lasts forever, but because it doesn't. By the time players reach the end of the journey, the fear of the universe's inevitable end has slowly transformed into acceptance. That emotional shift is incredibly rare, especially in games. This is what makes Outer Wilds such a compelling example of existential dread. It confronts players with one of humanity's oldest fears, the idea that everything, including ourselves, will eventually come to an end. But instead of asking us to fight against the truth, it asks us to embrace it. In doing so, it creates a kind of horror that is both deeply unsettling and strangely beautiful, leaving players not with fear, but with a new appreciation for the fleeting nature of existence. Resident Evil 7, another game that is marketed as a horror game, let's not get it twisted here. It embraces one of body horror's oldest and most visceral fears, the corruption of the human form. Baker family and the mold constantly blur the line between person and monster, showing bodies twisted, regenerating, and transforming into something almost unrecognizable. What makes these moments so effective isn't simply their graphic nature, but the loss of the bodily autonomy they represent. Characters don't merely die, they become something else entirely, turning the body itself into the source of the horror. What separates Resident Evil 7 from more abstract or symbolic forms of body horror is how direct and physical it is about that transformation. The mold doesn't just change people visually, it overwrites them. It spreads through their flesh, consumes individuality, and replaces human behavior with something controlled by an extreme force. This creates a constant sense that the body is no longer a safe or stable thing. It is something that can be taken, rewritten, and weaponized without consent. The Baker family exemplifies this horror in a particularly disturbing way because they are not presented as a distant monster, but as people who have been violently repurposed. Their humanity is still recognizable in fragments, voices, mannerisms, facial expressions, but it is constantly being overridden by something invasive and inhuman. There's a moment in the game where you sit down with the previous version of Jack, where he tells you to save his family because this is not them. That is a gut punch to you who has went through this whole game probably hating this guy for just not dying, for coming back every single time after you seemingly killed him. The real version of him is pleading with you to do something about this, to save his family. And that is the scariest part of this game. The fact that even you as a person can be corrupted into someone that you aren't. And although this game is a horror game, I think that part, the body horror part, where you become something that you aren't, is a lot scarier than any of the jump scares could be. Bugsnax hides one of gaming's strangest body horror concepts beneath an intentionally cheerful exterior. At first, transforming your limbs into food feels silly, even humorous. Over time, however, the novelty fades and the players begin recognizing the disturbing implications of bodies changing against their owner's control. Because the game introduces these ideas gradually, the realization lands far harder than if it had been presented itself as horror from the beginning. The contrast between its colorful presentation and unsettling premise makes the transformation feel unexpectedly disturbing. What makes Bugsnax so effective as a form of body horror is how casually it treats transformation. The idea of creatures and characters altering their physical form is introduced in a way that initially feels playful and harmless, almost like a cartoon logic extension of its bright, whimsical world. But as the game continues, the same mechanics start to feel increasingly uncomfortable. Characters don't just eat Bugsnax, they become them. Limbs, faces, and entire bodies shift into food-like forms, and the more you see it happen, the harder it becomes to ignore how irreversible and unnatural the process actually is. The horror comes from the fact that these transformations are not framed as immediate tragedies. Instead, they are treated as progress, curiosity, or even improvements in some ways. That normalization is what makes it so unsettling. The game slowly conditions the player to accept something that, outside of its presentation, is deeply disturbing. The loss of bodily identity without resistance or consequences. By the time the implications fully set in, the process has already been a routine. Another important aspect of Bugsnax body horror is how it removes control from the subject entirely. The characters who transform are not portrayed as actively choosing to become something else in a meaningful way. They are drawn into it, almost passively, as if their bodies are being rewritten by external forces they cannot fully understand or resist. The loss of bodily autonomy is what elevates the concept beyond simple novelty. It creates the underlying discomfort that lingers beneath the game's bright surface, constantly reminding the player that what they are seeing is fundamentally wrong, even if the tone refuses to acknowledge it. Its world is colorful, its creatures are playful, and its presentation is intentionally inviting. But that very contrast amplifies the unease, because the player is constantly forced to reconcile what they are seeing with how they are meant to feel about it. The more comfortable the game tries to be, the more unsettling its implications become. That right there is what makes Bugsnax such a strong example of body horror. It doesn't rely on gore or shock, it relies on normalization. By wrapping transformation, identity loss, and physical distortion into a cheerful aesthetic, it creates a kind of horror that only fully reveals itself once the player realizes they've already accepted something they shouldn't have. So, we talked about horror games, we talked about psychological games, we've talked about body horror, talked about existential dread from horror games and from non-horror games. But none of those games have managed to create a feeling quite like Minecraft has. Because Minecraft has no story forcing you to be scared, no scripted monster introduction, no narrator manipulating you, no gruesome transformations, no cosmic philosophy, just a lonely world, a cave, a strange sound, and somehow millions of players have shared that exact feeling of looking into the darkness and thinking, I really don't want to go down there. Minecraft's horror emerges from complete and uncompromising solitude. Unlike most survival games, there are no friendly NPCs to reassure you, no voiced companions to break the silence, and no scripted moments reminding you that someone is coming to help. The world stretches infinitely in every direction, yet it often feels empty rather than alive. Long periods of silence make every cave sound, distant groan, or ambient noise feel significant, as though the world is reacting to you rather than simply existing around you. What makes this isolation so effective is how normal it feels at first. You spawn into a world that is calm, open, and almost peaceful, and for a while that comfort lulls you into a sense of routine. You mine, you build, you explore, but always alone. There is no confirmation that anyone else exists anywhere in this vast world. Over time, the absence begins to settle in. In those moments when the soundtrack quiets and you regain consciousness during a mining trip, it's hard not to think, am I really alone in this world? That question lingers precisely because the game never answers it. Minecraft never breaks its own illusion of solitude. There are hostile mobs, of course, but they don't feel like a social presence. They feel like natural hazards, like wind or weather. The world gives you no reassurance that you are part of something larger. Even structures like villages, despite containing NPCs, feel more like isolated systems rather than living societies. Everything exists, but nothing feels connected. This creates a subtle kind of unease that builds over long play sessions. The familiarity of games start to shift into something slightly off. You know the rules, you know the mechanics, but emotionally, the world never feels shared. It feels observed only by you. That quiet realization that there is no sign of another mind behind anything you see turns what is usually a comforting sandbox into something strangely unsettling. In that sense, Minecraft becomes frightening not because it tries to scare the player, but because companionship becomes its own kind of presence, and the longer you stay in the world, the more the silence starts to feel intentional. I can't be the only one that has been playing Minecraft before, and like I wrote in that script, you're out walking around, cutting down trees, maybe you're farming, maybe you've already made a giant world. You've built a city, you've built structures, you're walking around in it. C418 is playing in the background, and eventually it cuts out. And you hear your footsteps on the stone, and you hear yourself building, and everything becomes a bit too loud. And you really think to yourself, am I the only one around? Now, obviously, yeah, you're the only one, unless you opened it to LAN and your friends are on, or you're in a realm. But the unease comes from the fact that in this game, it's hard to comprehend the fact that you are the only player in this infinite world, infinitely generating, randomized world, and it's all yours, and it makes you feel just a bit uneasy. So that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching me. Once again, I really apologize for taking so long to get this out. I've kind of been juggling a couple other creative projects going on in my life right now, and this has not taken a back seat, but I've definitely been prioritizing other sorts of creative projects. More information on that soon to come. I hope, I'm not going to give away too many details, but hopefully you'll see, soon, within about a year. I want to say thank you so much for watching, everybody. I just hit 50 subscribers, and honestly, that's kind of wild to think of 50 real people liking my content enough to want to watch me continuously. So thank you to everybody who has commented. Thank you to everybody who has watched a video. Thank you to everybody who has subscribed. It keeps me going. It makes me feel fantastic that what I'm making is bringing joy to other people. And not to get too soppy, but I appreciate it a lot. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.